My name is Rebecca. I am 33 years old, and after my mom's funeral, my sister's husband stood up and said the investments and the $5 million estate belonged to my wife, the eldest child. The attorney and I looked at each other, then we both started laughing. Because his wife was not the executor, the beneficiary, or even aware that they had been paying rent to a corporation I owned for the last 2 years. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who tried to tear you down for their own financial gain. The air inside my mother Sylvia's sprawling Massachusetts mansion was thick with the scent of expensive white lilies and catered hors d'oeuvres. It was the post-funeral reception, a gathering meant for quiet mourning and shared memories of a woman who had just passed away. Instead, it felt like a calculated theatrical performance, and my brother-in-law Trey was firmly center stage. Trey was a tall, charismatic African-American man who owned a luxury car dealership. He always wore custom-tailored suits that projected an image of endless, effortless wealth. He stood at the head of the massive mahogany dining table, tapping a silver spoon against his crystal wine glass to command the attention of the crowded room. Dozens of faces immediately turned toward him. Aunts, uncles, my mother's wealthy country club friends, and affluent neighbors all ceased their hushed conversations. I stood quietly near the arched doorway of the living room, holding a glass of sparkling water. I watched as Trey reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper with a dramatic, practiced flourish. "Thank you all for being here to honor Sylvia Trey," began his deep voice, projecting a perfect blend of mourning and masculine authority. "As the man of this house and the husband to Sylvia's devoted eldest daughter, Caroline, I have an incredibly important duty to fulfill today." Sylvia wanted her final wishes made strictly clear to all her loved ones so there would be no confusion and absolutely no unnecessary legal battles regarding her assets. He unfolded the crisp white paper slowly, making sure everyone in the immediate vicinity saw the bold handwriting and the fresh blue notary stamp at the bottom of the page. Just 2 weeks ago, Sylvia updated her will. Trey announced, his eyes locking directly onto mine across the silent room. She was fully aware of who stood by her side during her darkest days and who chose to abandon this family when things got hard. Therefore, Sylvia has officially left this $5 million estate, all her investment portfolios and her remaining physical assets entirely to her eldest daughter, Caroline. A collective gasp rippled through the elegant room. Heads turned rapidly in my direction, eyes filled with harsh judgment, misplaced pity, and thinly veiled disdain. I did not flinch. I did not drop my glass. I simply watched him perform his carefully rehearsed monologue. Trey was not finished. He took a heavy step forward, raising his voice so even the catering staff pausing in the kitchen could hear every word. "Rebecca," he said, addressing me with a look of pure, unadulterated contempt. "You left this family 3 years ago because your mother refused to mortgage this house to fund your miserable little accounting firm. You turned your back on your own flesh and blood. You do not get to show up today, shed a few fake tears, and expect a massive payout. You are officially disinherited." The sheer audacity of his lie was almost impressive. I had not left because I wanted her money. I had moved to Chicago 3 years ago because I flatly refused to sign off on fraudulent financial documents to save his failing luxury car dealership. But nobody in this room knew that secret. They only knew the twisted narrative Trey and Caroline had been carefully spinning for years. Right on cue, my older sister Caroline stepped forward to join her husband. At 36, Caroline had perfected the dark art of playing the tragic victim. She was dressed in an impeccable black designer dress, clutching a delicate lace handkerchief to her chest. She leaned her head against Trey's strong shoulder, letting out a perfectly timed trembling sob that echoed in the quiet space. "It breaks my heart that it has to be this way," Caroline cried softly, ensuring her voice carried a tone of absolute shattered heartbreak. "But Mom was so hurt, Rebecca. You moved to Chicago and just forgot about her. Trey and I bathed her, we fed her, we took her to every single doctor's appointment. We carried the entire burden of her terrible illness while you were off living your selfish life in the city." The disappointed murmurs in the room grew louder. My Aunt Patricia, who had always blindly favored Caroline, shook her head in sheer disgust and muttered something about ungrateful children ruining families. I could see the guests forming a unified hostile front against me. In their easily manipulated eyes, I was the ultimate villain. I was the cold, heartless younger daughter who had abandoned a dying woman only to return like a vulture circling a lucrative inheritance. I need you to understand how deeply they had committed to this massive lie. For the last 3 years, Caroline had posted constant updates on social media, checking into hospitals, posting photos, holding my mother's frail hand, and writing long, dramatic paragraphs about the exhausting life of a primary caregiver. She painted herself as a modern-day saint, sacrificing her youth, her marriage, and her energy for our sick mother. Trey played the fiercely supportive husband, constantly praising his wife's dedication, while subtly hinting to anyone who would listen about the massive financial toll it was taking on their young family. But as I stood there listening to Caroline's weeping and Trey's self-righteous declarations, I felt no anger. I felt no urge to scream, defend myself, or run out the front door in tears. I just felt a cold, highly calculating calm wash over my entire body. They were banking on my silence. They assumed I would be far too ashamed to fight back in front of the entire extended family and their wealthy friends. They genuinely thought I was still the quiet, compliant younger sister who would simply lower her head and walk away to avoid a nasty public confrontation. Caroline wiped her eyes daintily and looked directly at me, her expression shifting from deep sorrow to something remarkably sharp and victorious. "Mom loved you, Rebecca," she said, her voice dripping with heavy condescension. "But she knew you only cared about yourself. It is time for you to leave our home." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, pressing down on everyone in the room. They were waiting for me to break. They were waiting for me to apologize or run. Instead, I took a slow, deliberate sip of my sparkling water, set the crystal glass down on a nearby side table, and reached into my sleek leather tote bag. "I am not going anywhere, Caroline," I replied, keeping my voice dangerously steady and echoing loudly across the dining room. "And before we talk about who actually owns this beautiful home, I think everyone standing here today would absolutely love to see exactly how you and your husband financed your supposed caregiving." Trey let out a booming theatrical laugh that bounced off the high vaulted ceilings of the foyer. He shook his head, looking around at the gathered relatives as if I had just told a hilarious, delusional joke. He adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke suit jacket and took 2 large, deliberate steps toward me. He used his height and broad shoulders to physically loom over me, a classic intimidation tactic he had used on my mother for years. "Financed our caregiving!" Trey repeated, his voice dripping with venomous amusement. "Are you actually trying to audit us right now, Rebecca? Is that what this is? You spend 3 years hiding in your tiny Chicago apartment, playing with your little spreadsheets, and you come back thinking you can question how my wife and I kept your mother alive." He turned to the crowd, opening his arms in a gesture of utter exasperation. "This is exactly why Sylvia did not want you here today. You have absolutely no concept of reality. You have no idea what it took to manage her specialists, her in-home nurses, and her daily medications. You just sit behind a desk pushing numbers around like a glorified calculator." Caroline sniffled loudly into her designer tissue, playing the exhausted martyr flawlessly. "We gave up everything for her," she whispered, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. "We drained our own savings just to keep her comfortable." Trey nodded solemnly, playing right into his wife's cue. He reached into his leather briefcase resting on the nearby credenza and pulled out a thick, official-looking document stack. He walked back to the massive mahogany dining table and slammed the papers down with a sharp, violent smack that made several guests jump. "You want to talk about finances," Rebecca Trey challenged, pointing a manicured finger at the stack. "Let us talk about finances. Right there is the final bill from Massachusetts General Hospital, $150,000. That was for the experimental treatments your mother needed in her final months. Treatments that insurance flat out refused to cover. Caroline and I took on that crushing debt because we actually loved her. We did not hesitate. We did not run away like you did." The room erupted into shocked, sympathetic murmurs. Wealthy neighbors shook their heads in disbelief, casting furious glares in my direction. Aunt Patricia crossed her arms over her chest, her face red with righteous indignation. "You should be thoroughly ashamed of yourself, Rebecca," Aunt Patricia scolded loudly from across the room. "Your sister and brother-in-law nearly bankrupted themselves to give your mother a fighting chance, and you stand there demanding answers. You have some nerve showing your face at this reception." Trey leaned over the table, pressing his knuckles against the polished wood, his dark eyes locked onto mine with predatory triumph. He thought he had completely checkmated me. He thought the sheer weight of a six-figure medical bill would crush whatever defiance I had left. "So, here is my offer to you, Rebecca Trey," said his voice dropping to a low mocking whisper meant only for me, but loud enough for the closest relatives to hear. "If you want to keep whatever tiny shred of dignity you have left in this family, you will take out your checkbook right now. You will write a check for $75,000 to cover exactly half of what Caroline and I sacrificed. You pay your fair share of your mother's life, and then you pack your bags, walk out that front door, and never contact us again." He stood up straight, crossing his arms over his chest, waiting for my inevitable collapse. He expected tears. He expected me to stammer, to panic, to make excuses about how I could never afford such a massive sum on my meager salary. He expected me to flee in utter humiliation, effectively surrendering the $5 million estate to him without a single fight. Instead of crying, I simply stared at the hospital bill resting on the table. My pulse was completely steady. My breathing was calm. A terrifying, icy composure washed over my entire being. Trey and Caroline had made a catastrophic miscalculation. They had spent the last 3 years convincing themselves and everyone else that I was just a lowly, struggling bookkeeper doing data entry in a gloomy cubicle. They had no idea what my actual profession was. I am a forensic accountant. I do not just file taxes or balance corporate ledgers. I am a specialized financial investigator. I spend my days tracking down hidden offshore accounts, dismantling complex shell companies, and testifying in federal court against wealthy, white-collar criminals who think they can outsmart the system. I hunt missing money for a living. I unravel sophisticated fraud rings that move millions of dollars across international borders. Compared to the corporate criminals I normally destroy on the witness stand, Trey was a sloppy, arrogant amateur. For the past 2 years, I had not been ignoring my mother. I had been quietly, methodically investigating every single transaction moving in and out of her accounts. I knew exactly how Trey's luxury car dealership was hemorrhaging cash. I knew about the massive predatory business loans he had defaulted on. I knew about the secret gambling debts he had racked up on weekend trips to Atlantic City. I knew exactly how much he and Caroline had been siphoning from my mother's retirement funds to maintain their illusion of endless wealth. I looked at Trey's custom-tailored suit. I looked at the heavy gold Rolex gleaming on his wrist. I looked at Caroline's expensive black designer dress and the fresh diamond tennis bracelet sparkling around her wrist. They bought all of it with stolen money. They bought all of it with my mother's money. And they had the absolute sheer audacity to stand in my mother's house next to her funeral flowers and demand that I pay them. I let the heavy, suffocating silence stretch out for another 10 seconds. I let Trey bask in his false sense of absolute victory. I wanted him to feel powerful. I wanted him to feel untouchable because it would make his impending destruction infinitely more devastating. I slowly walked over to the mahogany dining table and picked up the hospital bill. I flipped through the itemized pages, pretending to study the terrifyingly high numbers. The entire room held its breath, waiting for my total surrender. $150,000, I said, my voice echoing clearly through the tense silence. "That is an incredibly generous sacrifice, Trey. It truly is." Trey smirked, exchanging a victorious, knowing glance with Caroline. "It is what family does, Rebecca. Something you obviously know nothing about." "You are absolutely right," I replied, dropping the hospital bill back onto the table. I unclasped the gold hardware on my leather tote bag and reached inside. Family is supposed to step up when things get difficult. Which is exactly why I find this particular hospital bill so utterly fascinating. My Aunt Patricia scoffed loudly, her face twisting into a mask of pure disgust. She took a step forward, completely unable to contain her outrage, as my hand remained inside my bag. Fascinating. You find your own mother's medical debt fascinating. You have always been a cold, calculating girl. Rebecca, it is frankly sickening. While Caroline was here holding your mother's hand, wiping her brow and sacrificing her best years, you were completely unreachable. You only ever cared about your own selfish ambition. You ran away to Chicago because you could not handle the responsibility of caring for a sick parent. The rest of the extended family quickly followed her lead, chiming in like a perfectly orchestrated chorus of disapproval. My uncle stepped up beside Patricia, shaking his head. Your sister and brother-in-law stepped up when you walked out, Rebecca. They took a massive financial hit to keep Sylvia comfortable. You owe them this money. Paying half of that bill is the absolute minimum you can do to make up for your disgraceful absence. Other guests murmured their strong agreement, casting judgmental glances my way. They had fully bought into the narrative that Caroline was the golden child who gave up everything, while I was the ultimate scapegoat who fled at the first sign of hardship. Caroline leaned heavier against Trey, burying her face in his chest. I do not want her money, Trey, she cried, her voice muffled but perfectly audible. I just want my sister to care. I just wanted her to be here for Mom when it mattered most. Money cannot buy back the time she lost. Trey wrapped a protective arm around her, glaring at me with fiery intensity. Stop playing games, Rebecca, he barked, pointing a finger at my face. Stop digging in your bag and write the check. You cannot manipulate your way out of this. The entire family sees exactly who you are today. I did not break eye contact with him. I slowly pulled my hand out of my leather tote bag, holding a thick, heavy stack of documents bound by a heavy black clip. The top page featured the unmistakable raised gold seal of a major national bank, indicating that the documents were officially certified and legally binding. I held the stack up so the overhead chandelier light caught the gold seal, making sure Trey and the rest of the room recognized exactly what they were looking at. The loud murmurs in the room began to quiet down, replaced by a sudden creeping sense of confusion. This hospital invoice you just threw in my face, Trey, I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the silence. It is an itemized billing statement. It perfectly details the total charges for the experimental treatments at Massachusetts General Hospital. But you deliberately left out the final page. You conveniently forgot to show everyone the page that displays the actual account balance. I picked up his hospital bill and held it next to my certified documents. If you look at the balance due on this invoice, you will see a massive string of zeros. The bill has already been paid in full. I tossed his invoice aside and slapped my heavy stack of certified bank statements down onto the mahogany dining table. I pushed the documents across the polished wood. They slid smoothly, stopping right in front of Trey and Caroline. I suggest you open that folder, Trey, I instructed coldly. Turn to page 4. Go ahead. Show Aunt Patricia. Show everyone standing here today who is so deeply concerned about family sacrifices. Trey hesitated, his arrogant smirk faltering for the very first time. He stared at the folder like it was a live explosive. When he did not move, I stepped forward and flipped the folder open myself, pressing my finger firmly against a highlighted line of text. If you look right here on page 4 of my certified bank records, you will see a direct wire transfer, I explained, projecting my voice so every single guest in the dining room heard the truth. The recipient is Massachusetts General Hospital. The date matches the exact day the hospital demanded payment before they would begin the experimental protocol for Mom. And the amount transferred is exactly $150,000. The air in the room vanished. Aunt Patricia gasped, leaning in to look at the paperwork. The stark black ink on the certified bank statement was undeniable. The routing numbers, the dates, the massive financial figure. Everything proved my words were absolute facts. I did not abandon our mother, Caroline, I said, turning my gaze to my sister who had suddenly stopped her fake crying. I paid for her entire treatment out of my own pocket so she could live. I wired that money directly to the hospital billing department because I knew if I handed that cash to you or your husband, it would miraculously disappear into your failing business. Trey swallowed hard. He looked down at the bank statements, his mind scrambling to formulate a new lie. You, he started, his voice losing its booming confidence. You sent that money from a corporate account. We thought it was a charity grant. We thought the hospital found a donor. I let out a sharp, genuine laugh. A charity grant, I countered immediately. My name is listed as the authorizing signatory on that wire transfer tray. You knew exactly who paid that bill. You stood here today, in front of all these mourning people, and demanded I pay you $75,000 for a medical debt that I already paid in full. The aunts and uncles who had just been scolding me were now staring at Trey and Caroline with wide, horrified eyes. The golden child facade was showing its first major crack. But Caroline was quick. She stepped away from Trey, her eyes darting around the room, trying desperately to salvage the situation. Well, she stammered loudly, her face flushing crimson. We paid. We paid for other things, Caroline blurted out, her voice pitching an octave higher as her eyes darted frantically around the dining room. We paid for the home care and the daily living expenses. You have absolutely no idea how expensive it is to keep a dying woman comfortable, Rebecca. I stepped closer to the table, keeping my posture entirely relaxed, while the rest of the room remained utterly motionless. The wealthy neighbors who had just been glaring at me were now staring at Caroline with narrowed, suspicious eyes. The heavy silence in the room was no longer pressing down on me. It was suffocating my sister. That is a fascinating point, Caroline, I replied smoothly. Medical care is undeniably expensive. Which brings me to my next question. I reached back into my leather tote bag and pulled out a second, thinner folder. I snapped it open and held up a thick stack of printed web pages. If I paid the $150,000 directly to the hospital for Mom's treatments, where exactly did the $200,000 you raised on GoFundMe for Mom's medical expenses go? The collective gasp from the guests was audible. Aunt Patricia dropped her hand from her chest, her jaw falling open as she stared at the printed pages in my hand. I made sure to hold them up high. They were full-color printouts of the crowdfunding campaign Caroline had aggressively pushed across all her social media platforms. I had highlighted the final total in bright yellow marker, $210,450 to be exact. Where did it go, Caroline? I asked, taking one step toward her. Because according to these updates you posted every single week for 2 years, you begged Mom's friends, our extended family, and complete strangers for donations. You explicitly stated the funds were needed for life-saving experimental treatments and crushing hospital bills. But we have just established with certified bank records that I paid those hospital bills. So I will ask you again. Where is the $200,000? Caroline's mouth opened and closed without any sound coming out. She looked at Trey with wild, panicked eyes. The golden child facade had completely shattered, leaving behind a terrified woman who suddenly realized she was caught in a massive public lie. Trey stepped in front of his wife, puffing out his chest to shield her from the piercing stares of our relatives. You think you are so smart, Rebecca? He shouted, his voice echoing aggressively off the walls. You think you can just march in here and interrogate us? We use that money to survive. Do you know what 24/7 caregiving does to a family? We had travel costs. We had to hire specialized private nurses when we were too exhausted to stand. We had to buy organic meals, medical equipment, and handle modifications to this massive house. The GoFundMe covered the daily grueling reality of keeping Sylvia alive. He swept his arm toward the crowd, attempting to gaslight the very people he had taken money from. You all know how hard Caroline worked, Trey bellowed, locking eyes with Aunt Patricia. You saw her sacrificing her sanity. We were completely drowning in caregiving expenses. Rebecca sent one wire transfer and thinks she gets to question our entire existence. Some of the older relatives looked momentarily conflicted. Trey was a master manipulator, and he knew exactly how to play on their emotions. He was banking on their sympathy for the exhausting reality of hospice care. But he was trying to use emotional manipulation on a forensic accountant, and numbers do not have emotions. They only tell the absolute truth. Travel costs, I repeated, tilting my head as I looked at Trey's custom-tailored suit. That is a very bold defense, Trey. Let us break down that logic right now. You and Caroline sold your modest condo 3 years ago and moved directly into this $5 million mansion with Mom. You lived here rent-free. Your daily commute to care for her consisted of walking down a single flight of carpeted stairs. What travel costs are you claiming? Did you charter a private jet to travel from the master bedroom to the kitchen? A few guests actually let out shocked, stifled laughs. Trey's jaw locked tightly, his hands curling into tight fists at his sides. As for the specialized private nurses, I continued, not giving him a single second to recover. Mom's Medicare and supplemental insurance completely covered her hospice care team. I know this for a fact because I am the one who spent 30 hours on the phone with the insurance adjusters making sure her coverage was perfectly optimized. The agency billed the insurance directly. You did not pay a single dime out of pocket for any nurses. I took another step closer, tapping the GoFundMe printouts against the palm of my hand. So we have eliminated the hospital bills, the travel costs, and the nursing fees. We are left with groceries and perhaps some medical equipment. Are you honestly trying to convince this room full of intelligent people that you spent $200,000 on organic apples and a wheelchair ramp that equates to roughly $8,000 a month in pure grocery expenses? Caroline began to shake visibly. The designer lace handkerchief she had used to fake her tears was now crumpled tightly in her fist. She looked around the dining room, desperately searching for a single friendly face. She found none. The wealthy country club friends were whispering furiously among themselves. Aunt Patricia looked physically ill, likely realizing she had personally donated thousands of dollars to a scam. "You stole it!" A voice cut through the tension. It was my uncle standing near the doorway, his face purple with absolute fury. "Sylvia begged us for donations because you two claimed the hospital was going to cut off her treatments. We drained our own savings to help you. We did not steal anything," Trey roared back, pointing his finger aggressively at my uncle. "We managed this estate. We managed her life. We deserved every single penny of that money for what we had to endure." "You did not endure anything," I fired back, raising my voice to match his volume. "You used a dying woman as a prop to fund your luxury lifestyle. You used her illness to manipulate everyone in this room into paying for your designer dresses and your luxury cars." Trey let out a furious growl. He realized the crowd had completely turned against him. The emotional manipulation had failed. The gaslighting had failed. My logic had systematically dismantled every single excuse he tried to build. He was cornered, backed into a corner of his own making, with his theft exposed for everyone to see. But Trey was not the kind of man to accept defeat gracefully. When his back hit the wall, he did not surrender. He lashed out. He took another large step toward me, closing the physical distance between us until I could smell the expensive cologne he had undoubtedly purchased with my mother's money. His chest heaved with rapid, angry breaths, his eyes narrowing into dark slits of pure hostility. "You think you know everything about this family?" Trey hissed, his voice dropping to a menacing octave meant to intimidate me into silence. "You think a few bank statements give you the right to dictate our reality? Sylvia loved me like a son. She gladly gave us that money because we were actually present. We were the ones managing her estate, keeping this massive property running, and making sure she had a beautiful life at the end. She wanted my business to succeed. She believed in me." "Believed in you?" I repeated, maintaining my ground and refusing to let his physical intimidation push me back a single inch. "She did not believe in you, Trey. She was terrified of you. You used your natural charisma to charm her when her mind was sharp, playing the perfect devoted son-in-law. You brought her flowers, poured her tea, and acted like the protective man of the house. But the second her health began to decline, your charm turned into calculated manipulation. You convinced a sick, vulnerable woman that your luxury car dealership was just hitting a temporary rough patch. You fed her lies about inventory issues and market fluctuations. But I have seen the real financial forensics. Your business has been completely insolvent for 5 years. You were practically begging off-market lenders for cash. And when they cut you off, you turned my mother into your personal ATM. Trey's eyes darted frantically toward the murmuring crowd. The wealthy neighbors who had previously respected him as a successful entrepreneur were now whispering behind their hands, connecting the dots of his sudden flashy purchases. "You are lying!" Trey shouted, pointing a shaking finger at my face. "My business is thriving. We hit record sales last quarter. You are just trying to ruin my reputation because you are a miserable, lonely woman." I laughed, a sharp, humorless sound that echoed across the dining room. "Record sales. Is that how you justify the constant wire transfers from Mom's retirement accounts straight into your business operating fund? Or perhaps you use those record sales to cover your massive secret weekend losses at the blackjack tables in Atlantic City? Do not insult my intelligence, Trey." You bled her dry to maintain an illusion of wealth because your fragile ego could not handle the reality of your own monumental failures. You used her money to buy the very custom-tailored Italian suit you are wearing right now to her funeral. Caroline finally stepped out from behind her husband. Her face was streaked with ruined mascara, and her voice wavered between blind panic and pure rage. "How dare you speak to my husband that way?" she screamed, her perfectly manicured hands trembling. "We gave Mom the best care possible. I sat by her bed every single day. I held her hand. I sacrificed my social life, my mental health, my entire existence to make sure she never felt alone in this massive house." I turned my gaze slowly toward my sister. The sheer delusion required for her to believe her own lies was genuinely staggering. "You sacrificed nothing, Caroline," I replied coldly. "Do not stand in this room and pretend you are a devoted caregiver. I know exactly how you operated. You would walk into her room once a day, set up your expensive ring light next to her medical equipment, and take a carefully staged selfie holding her frail hand. You would immediately post it to Instagram with a long, agonizing caption about the daily heartbreak of watching a parent slip away. You soaked up the likes, the comments, and the endless praise from your followers. And the second you hit post, you wiped away your fake tears, walked right out of that room, and left the actual grueling work to the hospice nurses that insurance paid for." Aunt Patricia let out a loud, shocked gasp. She had commented on every single one of those photos. The entire family had praised Caroline's incredible dedication online. "That is a disgusting lie," Caroline shrieked, stamping her designer heel against the hardwood floor. "I was with her 24 hours a day. You were not here. You do not know anything. You were at the country club sipping mimosas while Mom struggled to breathe," I countered, raising my voice to cut through her hysterical shouting. "I tracked your credit card transactions, Caroline. I matched the timestamps of your tragic social media updates with your purchasing history. While you claimed to be sitting at her bedside holding a cold cloth to her forehead, your card was being swiped at luxury boutiques, high-end nail salons, and expensive brunch spots downtown. You even billed Mom's account for the professional photographer you hired to take candid family moments during her final months. You used her impending death as a content strategy to gain sympathy while secretly draining the very funds meant for her care." The room was completely electrified with tension. The extended family members were staring at Caroline in absolute horror. The golden child narrative they had believed for 36 years was disintegrating right before their eyes. The perfect, devoted eldest daughter was exposed as a shallow, greedy opportunist who treated her dying mother like a social media prop. Trey realized the emotional tide of the room had completely turned against them. The gaslighting was no longer working. The fake tears were no longer drawing sympathy from the wealthy crowd. He felt his dominance slipping away rapidly, and the desperation made him reckless. He slammed both of his heavy hands down onto the dining table, rattling the crystal glasses and silver platters violently. "Enough!" Trey roared, his voice booming with aggressive, furious authority as he tried to physically command the space. "I am absolutely done listening to these baseless accusations from a bitter, estranged daughter. You have no power here, Rebecca. You hold zero authority in this house. You think waving a few printed spreadsheets around changes the reality of this estate. You think you can just walk in here after 3 years of silence and dictate how this family operates? He stormed around the table, marching aggressively toward the end of the room where the family attorney Harrison stood quietly observing the chaos. Trey's face was flushed with frantic anger. He was done playing defense against my forensic evidence. He needed to reassert his control over the estate, the narrative, and the vast wealth he believed he rightfully owned. He reached into his jacket pocket with violent urgency, his eyes wild with defensive rage. You want to talk about facts, Rebecca? You want to talk about undeniable legal reality? Fine. Let us talk about what Sylvia actually wanted. Let us talk about the final binding legal word of the woman you abandoned. Trey stood in front of the heavy oak credenza where he had left his leather briefcase. He unzipped the main compartment with a sharp, aggressive tug that echoed loudly in the silent room. His large hands reached deep inside and pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope sealed with official wax. He held it high above his head, his towering frame dominating the space, ensuring every single guest in the dining room could clearly see the official legal binding. He marched back to the center of the mahogany table, glaring at me with eyes full of absolute venom and unshakable triumph. He slammed the heavy envelope down onto the polished wood with a deafening crack that made the crystal glasses rattle. "This is the only document that matters tonight," Trey announced, his deep voice vibrating with absolute certainty and condescension. "You can wave around your little certified bank statements and your printed web pages all you want, Rebecca. You can try to poison these good people against us with your forensic accounting tricks and your desperate accusations. But none of your manipulated numbers can override the binding legal directives of the deceased." He ripped open the thick envelope and pulled out several pages of heavy watermarked legal paper. The bright blue stamp of a certified public notary gleamed brightly at the bottom of the final page, placed right next to my mother's distinct, swirling signature. "This is Sylvia's final last will and testament," Trey declared loudly, holding the document out so the closest wealthy relatives could clearly see the ink. It was drawn up, signed, and officially notarized exactly 14 days before she passed away. She was of completely sound mind. We had 2 independent witnesses present who are not related to this family in any way. She wanted to make absolutely certain that her true final wishes were respected. She wanted to guarantee that the daughter who actually stayed by her side through the pain was rewarded, and the daughter who abandoned her got exactly what she deserved, nothing at all. Trey cleared his throat loudly, making a grand show of adjusting his posture as he began to read directly from the legal document. "I, Sylvia, being of sound mind and body, do hereby revoke all previous wills and codicils. I direct that my entire estate, including, but not limited to my primary residence, all connected real estate parcels, my entire stock portfolio, and all liquid financial assets shall pass entirely and exclusively to my eldest daughter, Caroline. I explicitly and intentionally exclude my youngest daughter, Rebecca, from receiving any portion of this estate." He dropped the heavy pages back onto the table, placing his large hands flat on the wood as he leaned heavily toward me. A triumphant, vicious smile stretched across his face. $5 million, Rebecca. The house, the investments, the antique collections, every single penny. It all belongs to Caroline. Your little audit means absolutely nothing. You have no legal standing to question how we spend our money, because as of 2 weeks ago, Sylvia legally made sure it was our money. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The aunts, uncles, and affluent neighbors who had just been horrified by my financial revelations were now staring at the notarized will in absolute shock. The legal weight of the document seemed to paralyze their outrage. In the eyes of the law, Trey had just presented the ultimate trump card. A dying mother's final legally binding wish was incredibly difficult to contest in any court. Caroline realized the power had swung back to their side. The transformation was instantaneous and terrifying to witness. She lowered the crumpled designer handkerchief from her face. The trembling, tragic sorrow that had consumed her features just minutes prior vanished completely as if it had never existed. Her spine straightened. Her shoulders pulled back. The fake watery grief in her eyes hardened into sharp, glittering arrogance. She walked around the dining table, her expensive designer heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor until she stood shoulder to shoulder with Trey. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, looking me up and down with an expression of pure, unfiltered disgust. "You really thought you could come in here and destroy my life, did you not?" Caroline sneered, her voice completely stripped of its previous breathless fragility. "You thought you could just show up in your cheap little business suit, throw some numbers around, and turn my own family against me. You have always been so incredibly jealous of me, Rebecca. You were jealous of my marriage, jealous of my beautiful lifestyle, and jealous that Mom always loved me more." She took a heavy step closer, pointing a manicured finger directly at my chest. "You are a miserable, lonely woman who spends her life looking at other people's money because you will never have any of your own. You ran away to Chicago because you knew you could never measure up to the high standard I set in this family. Mom saw right through your cold, calculating heart. That is exactly why she made sure you would never get a single dime of her hard-earned wealth. She wanted to protect me from your relentless greed." The sheer venom pouring from my sister's mouth caused several guests to take a physical step backward. The sweet, devoted caregiver act was entirely gone. Caroline was finally revealing the vicious, entitled bully she had always been behind closed doors. She was no longer hiding behind fake tears. She was claiming her throne. "This is my house now," Caroline stated, her voice echoing with absolute, undeniable authority. "These are my financial assets. These are my guests. You are nothing but an unwanted trespasser trying to extort a grieving family. I am completely done playing nice with you, Rebecca. I am done entertaining your pathetic attempts to ruin my stellar reputation." She pulled her phone from her clutch and held it up the screen, glowing brightly in the dim light of the dining room. "I am giving you exactly 24 hours, Caroline demanded, her tone dropping into a cold, ruthless ultimatum. "You have exactly 24 hours to go upstairs, pack whatever cheap garbage you brought with you, and get off my property forever. If I see your face in this house at this exact time tomorrow, I will call the local police. I will have you arrested for criminal trespassing, and I will personally press severe charges for harassment." Trey stood firmly behind her, crossing his massive arms and nodding in fierce agreement. "You heard my wife," Trey added, his dark eyes gleaming with aggressive victory. "You are completely defeated, Rebecca. Your little spreadsheet games are officially over. Pack your bags and get out of our house before we physically drag you out by the collar." They stood together, the perfect, wealthy, powerful couple, utterly convinced they had just delivered the final fatal blow to my entire existence. They were waiting for me to shatter. They expected me to look at the notarized will, realize the absolute hopelessness of my situation, and run away in tears. Instead, I looked at the notarized will resting on the mahogany table. I looked at Caroline's furious, arrogant face. I looked at Trey's puffed-up chest. I did not move toward the door. I did not flinch. I simply turned my head toward the far corner of the dining room, looking past the shocked relatives directly at the quiet, distinguished man who had been silently observing the entire confrontation. "I think it is time," I said softly. Harrison stepped out from the shadowed alcove near the grand staircase. At 60 years old, the seasoned trust and estate attorney possessed a quiet, unshakable authority that sharply contrasted with Trey's explosive outbursts. Harrison had served our family for decades. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit and carried a slim leather briefcase. His expression remained entirely neutral as he walked toward the center of the dining room. Trey immediately seized the opportunity to solidify his public victory. He snatched the notarized will off the mahogany table, nearly crumpling the heavy watermarked paper in his massive hands. He strode aggressively toward Harrison and shoved the document squarely against the attorney's chest. "Read it out loud to her," Harrison Trey commanded, his voice dripping with arrogant satisfaction. "Read the final legal directives to this ungrateful woman, so she finally understands that her little audit is entirely meaningless. Validate this document right here in front of everyone. Tell her that my wife is the sole legal heir to the $5 million estate, and that Rebecca gets absolutely nothing." Harrison took the document with practiced calm. He slowly retrieved a pair of reading glasses from his breast pocket, unfolded them, and placed them deliberately on the bridge of his nose. He looked down at the paper, his face giving away absolutely no emotion. The entire room of wealthy neighbors, country club friends, and judgmental relatives held their collective breath, waiting for the legal hammer to fall and crush me completely. Caroline crossed her arms, a vicious, triumphant smirk painted across her face. She was practically vibrating with the thrill of my impending public humiliation. Trey did not even wait for Harrison to finish reading. He turned his broad shoulders back toward me, his dark eyes gleaming with predatory delight. He walked over to the antique console table near the entryway, where the guests had left their coats and bags. He spotted the keys to my rental car resting near my purse. With a sharp, mocking laugh, Trey snatched the keys off the table. He marched back over to me and casually tossed the keys through the air. They hit my chest and clattered loudly onto the polished hardwood floor, landing right at the tips of my shoes. "Pick them up," Rebecca Trey ordered coldly, gesturing to the floor like he was commanding an obedient dog. "Pick up your keys, get in your cheap rental car, and scurry back to your miserable spreadsheet life in Chicago. You are completely finished here. This is our house. This is our money. You lost." The heavy silence in the room was deafening. Aunt Patricia let out a soft, satisfied sigh, clearly thrilled to see the family scapegoat finally put in her proper place. The rest of the extended relatives stared at me, their faces radiating an uncomfortable mixture of pity and superiority. They expected me to break. They expected me to drop to my knees, scramble for my keys, and run out the front door sobbing in absolute defeat. I did not move a single muscle. I did not look down at the keys resting on the floor. I kept my eyes locked entirely on Trey. In my line of work as a forensic accountant, I regularly sit across the interrogation table from incredibly powerful people. I have stared down corrupt corporate executives, arrogant hedge fund managers, and ruthless embezzlers who thought their wealth made them untouchable. I know exactly what panic looks like when it tries to disguise itself as anger. Trey was putting on a spectacular, aggressive performance, but beneath his booming voice and physical intimidation, I could see the tiny, frantic cracks in his foundation. He needed me to leave because my very presence threatened the fragile financial house of cards he had built. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the tension in the dining room stretch until it became almost physically unbearable for everyone watching. "Are you absolutely sure you want to submit that document to probate court, Trey?" I asked. My voice was quiet, icy, and completely devoid of any emotional reaction. The question hung in the air, sharp and chilling. Trey scoffed loudly, attempting to dismiss my words, but his eyes darted nervously toward Harrison for a split second. "What kind of stupid question is that?" Trey barked, stepping closer to me. "Of course we are submitting it to the court. It is a legally binding will. It guarantees that Caroline gets everything and you get nothing. Are you truly so delusional that you think you can talk us out of claiming our rightful inheritance?" I did not break eye contact. I tilted my head slightly, observing him, with the clinical detachment of an investigator cornering a suspect. "I am not trying to talk you out of anything, Trey," I replied smoothly. "I am simply asking if you fully comprehend the legal mechanics of the probate process. Because the moment Harrison walks into the county courthouse and officially files that notarized will, the entire estate becomes a matter of public record. A judge will be immediately assigned to oversee the distribution of Sylvia's assets. And do you know what a probate judge requires before a single penny can be legally transferred to Caroline?" Trey's jaw tightened. He opened his mouth to shout another insult, but the words seemed to die in his throat. He could sense the trap closing around him, even if he could not yet see the steel jaws. "The court requires a comprehensive mandatory accounting of the estate's financial history," I explained, raising my voice so every relative in the room could hear the fatal reality. "The judge will demand a full audit of all bank accounts, all investment portfolios, and all property deeds to ensure the estate's value is accurately assessed. Every single wire transfer, every mysterious cash withdrawal, and every signature authorized during the last 2 years of Mom's life will be subjected to intense federal scrutiny." Caroline gasped, her hand flying to her throat as the blood rapidly drained from her face. She suddenly understood the catastrophic danger they were in. The aunts and uncles shifted uneasily, the atmosphere pivoting from judgmental superiority to gripping suspense. They were no longer looking at me as a disgraced daughter. they were watching a prosecutor expertly dismantle a criminal. Aunt Patricia stepped back, her previous outrage replaced by a sudden, terrifying realization that she might be standing in the middle of a major federal crime scene. Trey's chest stopped heaving. The aggressive, towering posture he had maintained all evening suddenly appeared stiff and brittle. The heavy gold Rolex on his wrist caught the chandelier light as his hands twitched at his sides. He had thought the will was his impenetrable shield, a magical document that would instantly grant him millions and wash away his secret financial sins. He had completely failed to realize that the legal system he was trying to use to steal my mother's wealth was the exact same system that would rip his life apart. If you submit that will, Trey, I continued, taking one deliberate step forward, so I was standing directly in his personal space. You are willingly handing over 2 years of your fraudulent bank transfers to a federal judge. You are inviting the authorities to look at how you drained her retirement accounts to pay off your luxury car dealership's massive debts. You are handing them the exact evidence they need to indict you both. So I will ask you one more time. Are you absolutely certain you want to activate that document? Trey threw his head back and let out a booming theatrical laugh that echoed off the crystal chandelier above us. He clapped his hands together slowly, sarcastically applauding my warning. The sound was harsh and entirely devoid of genuine amusement. He looked around at the affluent neighbors and stunned relatives, flashing his signature million-dollar salesman smile. He was desperately trying to project the image of a successful, unbothered businessman dealing with a hysterical relative. You really missed your calling, Rebecca, Trey mocked, leaning casually against the edge of the mahogany dining table. You should have been a fiction writer instead of a glorified bookkeeper. You stand there throwing around words like federal scrutiny and indictments, hoping to scare my wife and me into dropping this will. You think stringing together a bunch of scary legal jargon is going to make us forfeit a $5 million estate? He adjusted his silk tie, his chest puffing out again, as he addressed the audience in the room. Sylvia loved us, Trey declared boldly. She adored Caroline, and she treated me like the son she never had. She knew my luxury dealership was navigating a tough post-pandemic market. She saw how hard I worked. So yes, she helped us out. She gave us financial gifts. She freely and willingly transferred money to my business accounts because she wanted to see her family thrive. There is absolutely no law against a wealthy mother being generous to her own children. Caroline immediately chimed in, clinging to her husband's arm. Exactly, she sneered, her voice thick with renewed arrogance. Mom wanted Trey's business to succeed. She happily wrote those checks. You are just bitter because she never gave a single dime to your pathetic little accounting firm. Family helps family, Rebecca. A gift is a gift. I kept my hands resting easily at my sides. I let them finish their coordinated self-righteous routine. I watched Aunt Patricia nod slowly, seemingly relieved by Trey's explanation. To the untrained ear, his defense sounded completely reasonable. A wealthy mother helping her golden child and charismatic son-in-law during a financial slump was a common story in their affluent suburban circles. But they were not dealing with a gullible country club audience. They were dealing with a forensic financial investigator. A gift, I repeated quietly, testing the word on my tongue. That is a very interesting legal defense, Trey. But since you are so incredibly confident in your strategy, let us break down exactly how the federal government views a gift during the probate process. I turned slightly to address the entire room, taking command of the space away from him. When you submit a will to probate court, the judge does not just blindly hand over the keys to a $5 million mansion. The court must first determine the exact total value of the deceased's estate. To do that, the court requires a comprehensive inventory of all assets. If a judge sees that hundreds of thousands of dollars were suddenly depleted from the principal accounts during the final years of Sylvia's life, that judge will mandate a forensic trace on every single missing dollar. Trey scoffed again, waving his hand dismissively. Let them trace it. I just told you they were legal gifts. Were they? I challenged, my voice slicing through his arrogant interruption. Because the Internal Revenue Service has very strict, very unyielding regulations regarding financial gifts. Any gift exceeding the annual exclusion limit requires the filing of an IRS Form 709. I have reviewed Mom's tax returns for the last 3 years. Not a single gift tax form was ever filed for the massive wire transfers you authorized into your dealership's operating accounts. Trey's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. So I continued relentlessly. When the probate auditors subpoena your business accounts, they are going to see massive unreported cash injections. Since Mom never filed the required gift tax documentation, the federal government will not view those transfers as loving family gifts. The IRS will view them as undeclared income, and the moment the IRS flags those transactions, they bring in the Financial Crimes Division. I took a slow, deliberate step toward the mahogany table. The room was deathly quiet now. The relatives were hanging on my every word, completely captivated by the meticulous destruction of Trey's defense. They will pull the last 36 months of Mom's bank statements. I explained, my tone strictly professional, like a professor giving a lecture on financial ruin. They will cross-reference the exact dates and timestamps of those massive wire transfers with Mom's medical records. And do you know what the federal auditors are going to find, Trey? They are going to find that the largest financial transfers to your luxury car dealership occurred on the exact same days Mom was actively receiving heavy intravenous pain medication for her treatments. Caroline gasped loudly, her hand clamping over her mouth. They will see that hundreds of thousands of dollars were wired out of her retirement accounts while she was highly sedated and cognitively impaired, I stated, locking eyes with Trey. The law has a very specific term for obtaining money from a vulnerable, heavily medicated senior citizen. It is not called a gift. It is called elder financial abuse. And when you use a computer network to transfer those stolen funds across state lines to save your failing business, that elevates the crime to federal wire fraud. Trey's arrogant facade finally shattered completely. The dark, rich color drained from his face, leaving him looking ashen and terrified. He looked down at the notarized will resting on the table as if it had suddenly caught fire. "You have zero proof of my business accounts," Trey stammered, his voice lacking all of its previous booming volume. "You are bluffing. You have no legal access to my dealership's financial records. You are just guessing." He tried to force another laugh, looking around at the relatives for validation, but no one was smiling back. They were all staring at him with mounting disgust. He was desperately clinging to his arrogance, trying to convince himself that I was just an estranged sister making empty threats. He thought his financial secrets were safely hidden behind corporate firewalls and LLC protections. "I am not guessing, Trey," I said softly. "I do not need your permission to access public business filings, lien records, or creditor lawsuits. You left a trail of financial devastation so wide that a first-year accounting student could follow it. You thought you were being clever by moving her funds through secondary accounts before dumping them into your dealership, but dirty money always leaves a footprint, always." Trey gripped the edge of the dining table, his knuckles turning white. He shook his head violently, refusing to accept the reality of the trap closing around him. "You are insane," he spat out. Sylvia signed everything willingly. She knew exactly what she was doing. This will prove it. This will prove she trusted me and Caroline entirely. "That will is nothing but a piece of paper you shoved in front of a dying woman," I replied coldly. "And submitting it is the exact key that will lock your prison cell." I watched Trey swallow hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously against his tight silk collar. He took a half-step backward, his eyes darting toward the heavy oak doors, as if calculating the distance to the exit. I did not give him the chance to retreat. I reached down and lifted my sleek black leather briefcase from the floor, placing it squarely on the center of the mahogany dining table. The metallic snap of the latch's opening sounded like a gunshot in the perfectly silent room. Everyone leaned in, magnetically pulled by the sheer weight of the impending revelation. I opened the briefcase and pulled out 3 thick, perfectly organized binders. Each one was color-coded and filled with hundreds of pages of bank statements, tax records, and corporate filings. I lined them up meticulously across the polished wood, creating a physical barricade of undeniable truth between myself and my sister. "Let us talk about your thriving business, Trey." I began opening the first red binder and laying it flat. "You love to brag about your luxury car dealership. You invite these relatives to your showroom, pour them expensive champagne, and let them take photos in front of cars. You sold them the image of a wildly successful entrepreneur. But an image does not pay commercial leases or supplier invoices. I pulled out a glossy multi-page financial report and slid it toward his side of the table. According to the state corporate registry and your most recent commercial credit filings, your dealership has been utterly insolvent for 4 consecutive years. You have not turned a legitimate profit since before the pandemic hit. 6 months ago, your primary financiers officially cut off your credit line because they discovered you were selling cars out of trust. You were secretly selling inventory, keeping the cash, and failing to pay back the lender. That is corporate theft, Trey. Trey opened his mouth to deny it, but his voice completely failed him. To cover those massive defaults, I continued, my voice steady and completely devoid of mercy. You needed an immediate, untraceable cash injection. Traditional banks would not touch you, so you turned to high-interest, off-market lenders. When they started threatening to seize your remaining assets, you panicked. And that is exactly when you realized my mother had a fully funded, entirely liquid retirement portfolio just sitting there. Caroline clutched her head, her perfectly styled hair falling into her face. We needed help, she sobbed loudly, trying to pivot back to her victim narrative. The business was just going through a transition. Mom wanted to save our livelihood. I slammed my hand flat against the table. She did not want to save a business, Caroline, I snapped. She did not even know the business was failing because Trey lied to her face every single day. But that is not even the worst part. Because Trey did not just use Mom's money to pay off his corporate creditors. I flipped open the second binder. I pulled out a series of bank statements and laid them side by side. These are international wire transfer receipts, I announced to the room. I spent the last 3 months tracking these specific routing numbers. They do not lead to automotive suppliers. They do not lead to marketing firms or business consultants. They lead directly to 3 offshore banking accounts located in the Cayman Islands. And those accounts are directly linked to high-stakes exclusive online gambling syndicates. Trey let out a strangled, desperate noise. His eyes were wide with pure terror. You have a severe gambling addiction, Trey, I stated, looking him dead in the eye. While Caroline was staging crying selfies next to Mom's hospital bed, you were sitting in this very mansion, placing $50,000 bets on international sports games. You lost over $400,000 in a single 6-month period. When your business ran dry, you used Mom's money to chase your losses. You bled a dying woman dry to feed a habit you were too arrogant to admit you had. I reached into the third binder. This was the kill shot. The absolute undeniable proof that elevated their actions from simple manipulation to severe, calculated federal felonies. I pulled out a clear plastic sleeve containing 6 high-resolution photocopies of bank authorization forms. I laid them out in a neat row right next to the notarized will Trey had just presented. For the government to pursue wire fraud, I explained they need proof of unauthorized access. They need evidence that the account holder did not willingly initiate the transfers. You claimed Mom happily wrote these checks to you. I pointed to the first authorization form. This transfer of $85,000 was initiated on October 12th. I cross-referenced this exact date with Mom's medical chart. On October 12th, Mom was in the intensive care unit on a heavy morphine drip. She was entirely nonverbal. She physically could not hold a pen, let alone authorize a complex international wire transfer. I pulled out a transparent sheet containing my mother's verified historical signature and laid it directly over the signature on Trey's bank transfer form. I hired an independent court-certified handwriting analyst to review these documents. I continued. The signature on this transfer form is a completely manufactured forgery. You forged a dying woman's signature to steal $85,000 to pay off a gambling debt, and you did it 5 separate times. The silence in the grand dining room was absolute. No one breathed. No one moved. I had provided the motive, the method, and the undeniable paper trail proving every single allegation. I had completely stripped away their polished, wealthy facade and exposed the rotten criminal core underneath. Trey stood frozen, staring at the forged signatures. His chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow breaths. He looked like a man standing on the trapdoor of a gallows, suddenly realizing the rope was already securely tied around his neck. You did not just borrow money from a generous mother-in-law, I said, my voice echoing with absolute finality. You committed elder financial abuse. Under federal law, exploiting a vulnerable, heavily medicated senior citizen for financial gain is a severe felony. When you deliberately target someone whose cognitive functions are compromised by terminal illness and heavy narcotics. The justice system does not view it as a simple family dispute. They view it as predatory exploitation. I stepped back from the table, allowing the entire room to absorb the gravity of those words. I wanted them to understand that this was no longer about a will or a house. This was about strict criminal liability. And when you take those stolen funds and move them through electronic banking channels to offshore gambling syndicates in the Cayman Islands. I continued, you trigger a completely different set of federal statutes. You committed wire fraud. Each individual transfer you made using those forged signatures constitutes a separate count of wire fraud. Each count carries a potential penalty of up to 20 years in federal prison. You did not just make a bad business decision, Trey. You built a criminal enterprise right here in my mother's dining room. Caroline let out a sharp, breathless gasp. She stumbled backward, her designer heels catching on the edge of the antique rug. She grabbed the back of a dining chair to steady herself, her eyes wide with mounting terror. She finally realized that her pristine, wealthy suburban life was evaporating, replaced by the very real threat of a federal indictment. But the financial devastation does not end with my mother's retirement accounts, I announced, pivoting my attention away from Trey and directly toward the crowd of wealthy relatives and affluent neighbors. Because my mother was not the only victim in this room today. I picked up the stack of GoFundMe printouts and held them high. For 2 solid years, Caroline and Trey looked all of you dead in the eye and begged for your financial support, I said, looking directly at Aunt Patricia, whose face had gone completely white. They told you Mom was going to lose her medical care. They posted heartbreaking updates claiming the hospital was threatening to stop her treatments. They manipulated your love, your loyalty, and your deep concern for my mother. And you responded with incredible generosity. You opened your checkbooks. You rallied your country club networks. You handed over more than $200,000 because you believed you were saving a life. The silence in the grand foyer was so profound you could hear the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. But soliciting funds across state lines under deliberately false pretenses is also a textbook definition of wire fraud. I explained, driving the final nail into their coffin. They took your hard-earned money, money you gave out of pure compassion, and they funneled it directly into Trey's failing luxury car dealership and his offshore gambling debts. You were not funding Mom's medical care. You were funding their lavish, fraudulent lifestyle. You bought Caroline's designer dresses. You paid for Trey's custom suits. You financed their illusion of wealth while they let insurance cover Mom's actual hospice care. The reaction was instantaneous and entirely explosive. The same relatives who had spent the last hour glaring at me, judging me for my supposed absence, completely turned their furious, unyielding disgust toward the golden couple. Aunt Patricia was the first to break the silence. Her hands were shaking violently as she clutched her pearl necklace. She took a step toward Caroline, her eyes blazing with absolute fury. "I gave you $25,000, Patricia yelled, her voice breaking with genuine outrage. "I pulled money from my own grandchildren's college funds because you sat on my couch and cried, telling me the hospital was going to send your mother home to die in pain. You sat in my house and lied to my face." Another uncle stepped forward, his face flushed dark red with anger. "We canceled our family vacation to donate to your campaign, Trey. You looked me in the eye at the country club and swore you were liquidating your own assets to save her. You told me you were completely broke, and all this time you were stealing from a dying woman and gambling our money away in the Caribbean." The crowd began to close in around the dining table. The affluent neighbors who had previously admired Trey's business acumen were now sneering at him with utter contempt. They realized they had been conned by a smooth-talking fraudster. The social elite of the neighborhood instantly stripped away Trey and Caroline's prestigious standing, reducing them to exactly what they were: common thieves. "Please," Caroline sobbed, holding her hands up in a desperate pleading gesture toward the angry relatives. "You have to understand. We were desperate, Trey's business was failing. We did not want to lose everything. We were just trying to survive the market crash. I did not want to lie to you. Trey told me we had to do it to keep the house. Shut your mouth! Caroline, Trey barked, his remaining composure snapping completely. Do not try to pin this on me. You loved spending that money. You loved showing off your new jewelry and acting like the wealthy, devoted daughter. You signed off on every single withdrawal. The beautiful, untouchable marriage they had projected for years was fracturing right in front of us. The pressure of the exposed fraud turned them against each other instantly. Caroline looked at her husband with pure hatred, realizing he was willing to throw her under the bus to save himself. You are disgusting, Aunt Patricia spat, looking back and forth between the two of them. Both of you. You used Sylvia's illness as a fundraising scheme. You stole from your own family. I want every single penny of my money back by the end of the week. Trey or I am personally calling the district attorney. Other voices immediately joined the chorus. Relatives began demanding their donations back, shouting over each other, creating a chaotic symphony of righteous anger. They were furious about the stolen money, but they were even more enraged by the deep personal betrayal. They had trusted the golden child. They had believed the carefully curated social media narrative. Now, standing in the harsh light of forensic evidence, they saw the ugly, greedy truth. Trey backed away from the table, his hands raised defensively as the crowd continued to press forward. He looked frantically toward the attorney, hoping for a lifeline, but Harrison remained silent, observing the scene with professional detachment. You cannot just take her word for it, Trey shouted over the angry voices, gesturing wildly toward me. She is trying to turn you against us so she can steal the estate. Do not forget about the will. Sylvia left everything to Caroline. The will proves she wanted us to have the money. We are the legal heirs to the $5 million estate. She cannot change that. The room suddenly quieted down. The relatives turned their attention back to the notarized document still resting on the table. Trey was desperately clinging to his final anchor. He believed that even with his fraud exposed, the $5 million inheritance would give him enough capital to pay everyone back, hire expensive defense lawyers, and escape the consequences of his actions. He thought the legal document was his absolute salvation. He firmly believed that possessing that single piece of paper somehow shielded him from the wrath of the very people he had conned. He looked at the heavy watermark on the document, drawing false courage from the blue notary stamp. He genuinely thought his ultimate payday was completely secure. I did not interrupt him. I simply turned my head and looked at Harrison, the family attorney, giving him a slight, respectful nod. The trap had been perfectly set. The audience was fully engaged. It was time for the final, devastating act of this tragedy. It was time to completely obliterate the last remaining piece of Trey's delusional reality. Harrison stepped fully into the bright light of the crystal chandelier, his presence commanding the immediate attention of every single person in the grand dining room. The heavy, suffocating silence that had fallen over the crowd shifted as all eyes locked onto the seasoned family attorney. He possessed a quiet, unshakable authority that sharply contrasted with the frantic, explosive energy radiating from my brother-in-law. Harrison had served our family's legal needs for nearly 4 decades. He knew exactly how to navigate high-stakes emotional volatility with absolute clinical detachment. Trey practically vibrated with desperate anticipation. His chest heaved as he snatched the notarized document off the mahogany table. He marched aggressively toward Harrison, shoving the heavy watermarked paper directly into the attorney's hands. Validate it, Trey demanded, his voice cracking slightly under the immense pressure of his collapsing reality. Tell my sister-in-law that her little financial audit does not change the law. Tell everyone standing in this house that Sylvia legally transferred the $5 million estate, the investment portfolios, and this entire property to my wife. Read the signature. Check the notary stamp. End this ridiculous witch hunt right now so I can kick this trespassing accountant off my property. Caroline moved to stand right behind her husband, her hands gripping his tailored suit jacket. Her face was streaked with ruined makeup, but her eyes burned with a fierce, terrified hope. She needed this will to be her absolute salvation. She needed it to shield her from the federal fraud charges I had just methodically laid out before our horrified relatives. Harrison did not flinch at Trey's aggressive tone. He did not let the shouting rush his process. He slowly retrieved a pair of silver reading glasses from his breast pocket, unfolded them with deliberate care, and placed them on the bridge of his nose. He took the document from Trey's trembling hands. The dining room became so quiet that the faint rustling of the heavy legal paper sounded like a roaring fire. Aunt Patricia held her breath. The affluent neighbors leaned forward, completely captivated by the unfolding legal drama. I stood perfectly still, my hands resting easily at my sides, watching the precise mechanics of my trap snap completely shut. Harrison examined the first page. His eyes scanned the introductory paragraphs, noting the standard legal phrasing establishing my mother's sound mind and body. He flipped to the second page, reviewing the specific clauses that explicitly disinherited me and named Caroline as the sole uncontested beneficiary of the vast estate. Finally, he turned to the last page. He spent a long, agonizing moment scrutinizing my mother's swirling signature, the signatures of the two independent witnesses, and the bright blue raised seal of the certified public notary. Trey shifted his weight from foot to foot. He wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. "Well," he snapped impatiently, "is it legal or not? Stop stalling and tell them the truth." Harrison slowly lowered the document. He took off his silver reading glasses and folded them neatly, placing them back into his breast pocket. He looked directly at Trey, his expression remaining entirely neutral and professional. "This will is entirely authentic, legally sound, and properly notarized," Harrison announced, his voice carrying clearly across the silent room. Trey let out a massive, booming exhale of relief. He threw his arms up in the air, turning to face the crowd of judgmental relatives with a vicious, triumphant glare. He barked a harsh laugh, pointing a finger at me. "I told you," he shouted, his confidence instantly inflating back to its previous arrogant levels. "I told all of you. It is entirely legal. The $5 million belongs to us. Sylvia gave us everything." Caroline let out a loud, shuddering sob of victory, burying her face in her hands, as if a giant executioner's blade had just been lifted from her neck. Aunt Patricia looked incredibly confused, glancing between my stack of certified forensic evidence and the legally binding will that Harrison had just validated. But Harrison was not finished speaking. He held up a hand, halting Trey's aggressive celebration dead in its tracks. However, Harrison continued, his tone dropping into a cold clinical register that immediately sucked all the oxygen out of the room. "It is completely worthless." Trey froze mid-laugh. His arms dropped heavily to his sides. He stared at the attorney, his dark eyes wide with total, uncomprehending shock. Caroline's triumphant sobbing stopped instantly. She lowered her hands from her face, looking at Harrison as if he had just started speaking an entirely different language. "What did you just say?" Trey asked, his voice barely a whisper. The booming arrogance had been entirely stripped away, replaced by raw, creeping panic. "I said the document is completely worthless," Harrison repeated firmly, stepping closer to the mahogany table and setting the notarized will down onto the polished wood. "It holds absolutely zero legal power. It will not grant you a single penny, it will not transfer a single stock portfolio, and it certainly will not give you ownership of this $5 million mansion." Trey's brain seemed to short-circuit. He lunged forward, grabbing the document off the table and waving it frantically in Harrison's face. "Are you out of your mind?" Trey roared, his vocal cords straining under the sheer volume of his desperation. "You just stood there and admitted it was authentic. You just confirmed the notary seal is real. You confirmed Sylvia's signature is real. It explicitly dictates that the $5 million estate belongs to my wife. How in the hell can a legally binding, properly notarized will be completely worthless? I will sue you for malpractice. I will have your law license revoked for standing here and playing games with my inheritance." Caroline grabbed Harrison's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the sleeve of his charcoal suit. She signed it. Caroline screamed hysterically, shaking the attorney's arm. "My mother signed it 2 weeks before she died. She wrote down that I get everything. The law says the most recent will always dictates the distribution of assets. You cannot just stand there and declare it void because you like my sister better. We have the legal paperwork. Harrison gently but firmly removed Caroline's gripping hand from his sleeve. He smoothed his suit jacket, completely unfazed by their volatile, screaming meltdown. He looked at them with the stern, disappointed expression of a professor dealing with highly unruly students who had fundamentally failed to understand the most basic concepts of their coursework. You are fundamentally misunderstanding how estate law operates in this country, Harrison explained, his voice slicing cleanly through their frantic shouting. A last will and testament is simply a legal set of instructions. It directs the probate court on how to distribute the assets that a person actually owns at the exact moment of their passing. Harrison pointed a steady finger at the document clutched tightly in Trey's shaking hand. That piece of paper is a perfectly valid set of instructions, Harrison stated. The notary stamp is completely real. The witness signatures are flawless. Your mother fully intended to give you the mansion and the $5 million investment portfolios when she signed that document 2 weeks ago. But the law is very clear, Trey. A will can only give away property that is legally held in the deceased person's name. You cannot bequeath assets that you no longer possess. Trey's jaw hung open. He looked from Harrison to the notarized will, his eyes darting back and forth in frantic, terrified confusion. What are you talking about? Trey demanded, his voice cracking sharply. Of course she owned the assets. She lived in this mansion. Her name was on the brokerage accounts. We saw the quarterly statements arriving in the mail every single month. She had $5 million. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, moving right to the edge of the dining table. The aunts, uncles, and wealthy neighbors had gone completely rigid, sensing the monumental impact of the impending legal strike. I looked directly into my sister's panicked, tear-streaked face, savoring the absolute destruction of her lifelong golden child status. Harrison is absolutely correct, I said, my voice ringing out with crystal-clear authority. Mom had every intention of giving you that massive fortune when she signed that paper 2 weeks ago. But she could not give you the $5 million, Caroline. She could not give you the investment portfolios, and she certainly could not give you this gorgeous, sprawling estate. Why not? Caroline shrieked, stepping back as if my words were physically striking her. Why could she not give it to me? Because she did not own any of it, I replied coldly, delivering the exact words that would obliterate their entire existence. She had not owned a single piece of this estate for over 2 years. Harrison nodded gravely, taking a deliberate step forward to address the completely bewildered room. It is a matter of absolute public record, Trey the attorney stated in his measured, professional tone. Exactly 24 months ago, Sylvia authorized the immediate transfer of all primary deeds, equity portfolios, and liquid assets completely out of her personal name. When she sat down with you and Caroline 2 weeks ago to sign that document, her individual net worth was practically zero. She could not legally leave the estate to Caroline because she possessed absolutely nothing to give. Trey shook his head violently, his face pale and slick with cold sweat. That is a blatant lie, he stammered, his voice cracking under the crushing weight of his collapsing scheme. We physically saw the monthly brokerage statements arriving in the mail. We lived inside this house every single day. We watched her sign the checks with our own eyes. You saw exactly what we meticulously engineered for you to see, I interjected, stepping closer so I could look directly into his panicked, darting eyes. You saw carefully monitored decoy accounts funded automatically with just enough cash to keep you entirely oblivious. Because 2 years ago, Mom finally woke up from your manipulation. She saw the massive gaping holes in her retirement funds. She saw the unauthorized wire transfers flowing directly to your offshore gambling accounts, Trey. She realized the charismatic son-in-law she blindly trusted was actually a predatory thief actively bankrupting her. Caroline let out a sharp, breathless gasp. She looked at her husband with sheer horror, her golden child fantasy burning to ashes right in front of her. Mom would have told me, Caroline cried defensively. She told me everything. She would never hide something so massive from me. She hid it from you because she was utterly terrified and deeply ashamed. I fired back, my voice firm and uncompromising. She was humiliated that she had let a smooth-talking con artist drain her life savings right under her nose. And more importantly, Caroline, she knew exactly how you would react. She knew you loved your luxury lifestyle and your pristine social media image far more than you cared about the harsh truth. If she confronted you, she knew you would immediately take his side and defend him to protect your own comfortable illusion. So she did the only thing she could possibly do to survive, I explained, looking around at the silent captive audience of relatives. She picked up the phone in the middle of the night and made a desperate secret phone call to the one person she had previously banished. She called me. I paused, letting the heavy reality of that secret reconciliation settle over the grand dining room. Mom called me in tears, absolutely broken and begging for help. She knew I was the only person in this entire family who possessed the forensic accounting brilliance required to aggressively stop the financial bleeding. She asked me to save her, and I did. I still remember the exact sound of her voice that night. It was late November, cold and raining. My phone rang at 2 in the morning. When I saw her contact name illuminate my screen after a year of complete silence, I fully expected to hear an emergency room nurse telling me she was gone. Instead, I heard my mother weeping. These were not the practiced polite tears she used to win arguments at our tense family dinners. These were the gut-wrenching, breathless sobs of a woman who had just watched her entire carefully curated world shatter into pieces. She told me she had found a hidden financial folder in Trey's home office while looking for a postage stamp. She had seen the offshore routing numbers. She had seen the massive unauthorized withdrawals. She finally realized that the dutiful son-in-law bringing her fresh coffee every morning was the exact same man bleeding her retirement accounts dry before lunch. She was completely broken. I flew back to Massachusetts the very next day. We did not meet here at the house. We met at a quiet, unassuming diner 2 towns over, so your extensive network of country club spies would not spot us. When I slid into the vinyl booth across from her, she did not demand my professional help. She did not act like the commanding, judgmental matriarch who used to dictate my every life choice. She reached across the sticky table, grabbed my hands tightly in hers, and offered the one thing I had spent 33 years waiting to hear. She offered a genuine, unconditional apology. She looked me dead in the eye and admitted exactly how horribly she had failed me. She cried openly as she confessed that she had been entirely blinded by your superficial perfection, Caroline. She admitted that she chose the easy, validating comfort of your fake smiles over the difficult, unyielding reality of my independence. She told me she deeply regretted every single time she compared us, every time she made me feel like my career was a joke, and every time she let Trey disrespect my intelligence. She told me she was immensely proud of the successful woman I had become entirely without her help. She begged for my forgiveness. She did not ask for it as a condition for my financial rescue, but because facing her own mortality and Trey's ultimate betrayal made her finally realize the toxic, poisonous environment she had created in this family. That afternoon in the diner changed everything for us. We forged an entirely new relationship right then and there, but we both knew we had to keep it a complete, airtight secret. We knew perfectly well that if you or Trey found out we were talking, you would immediately isolate her. You would restrict her phone access, monitor her visitors, and drastically accelerate your theft before I could intervene. So we played a brilliant high-stakes game of deception. While you were busy curating your tragic caregiver aesthetic online, Mom and I were rebuilding our bond in the shadows. I bought her a secondary untraceable prepaid phone. She kept it hidden securely inside a hollowed-out classic novel in the library. Every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, while you, Caroline, were busy attending your elite charity luncheons and spending her stolen money at luxury boutiques, Mom would lock the library doors and call me. We had long, secure video chats. We did not just discuss the fraud investigation. We talked about my actual life. We talked about my complex accounting cases. She finally took a genuine interest in my world. For the first time in my entire existence, she did not ask me why I was not married or why I was not living in a massive suburban fortress. She simply listened. I flew her to Chicago multiple times under the strict guise of specialized medical consultations with out-of-state experts. You and Trey happily put her on those planes because it gave you free weekends to enjoy this mansion by yourselves. We spent those entire weekends together in my city. We walked through modern art museums. We shared quiet, wonderful meals without the suffocating pressure of your constant social media documentation. We finally learned how to be a real mother and daughter. During those final 2 years of her life, she experienced genuine, authentic peace. She experienced love that was strictly non-transactional. She did not have to buy my affection with expensive gifts, luxury cars, or real estate investments. Caroline staggered backward, her designer heels scraping harshly against the floor. She clutched her stomach as if she had just sustained a severe physical blow. The absolute core of her identity was violently disintegrating right in front of everyone. Her entire self-worth was constructed on the arrogant, unwavering belief that she was the undisputed, universally adored golden child. The sudden realization that our mother had spent her final years secretly cherishing the outcast daughter was tearing her apart. "You are lying!" Caroline screamed, her voice cracking wildly as tears streamed down her face. She loved me. She told me I was her everything. She signed this will giving me the house. She wanted me to have it all. She would never betray me like that. I shook my head slowly, feeling absolutely zero pity for the sobbing, broken woman standing in front of me. She did not betray you, Caroline. She simply stopped letting you betray her. She signed that fake will 2 weeks ago because she knew it was the absolute only way to keep you compliant and quiet until the very end. She knew perfectly well that if she refused to sign that document, Trey would turn immediately hostile and you would make her final painful days a living hell. She gave you a meaningless signature on a worthless piece of paper just to buy her own peace. But she gave me her heart. She died knowing exactly who I was, and she died knowing exactly what you were. Trey stared at me, his mouth opening and closing silently. He realized that while he thought he was the ultimate con artist, running a brilliant long game, he was actually the one being masterfully played by a dying woman and her estranged daughter. The aunts and uncles watched in stunned fascination. The truth was fully exposed, but the legal trap was still waiting to be sprung. "Now," I said, shifting my gaze from Caroline's weeping face back to Trey's terrified eyes. "Let me explain exactly how we secured her financial legacy right out from under your greedy hands." I turned back to the mahogany table where the heavy notarized documents still rested. The bright blue notary stamp seemed to mock Trey now, a glaring symbol of his ultimate failure. "When Mom called me 2 years ago and I saw the massive financial bleeding you had caused, I knew we had to act with absolute, ruthless precision. I knew that simply transferring money to a different savings account or rewriting a standard will would never be enough to stop you. You were already embedded in her house, manipulating her daily life, intercepting her mail, and hovering over every check she wrote. If I had just frozen her bank accounts, you would have immediately realized I was involved. You would have retaliated by restricting her access to her own doctors, isolating her completely, and making her final years a living nightmare. We needed a legal fortress. We needed a structure so impenetrable that even your most aggressive manipulative tactics would bounce right off it. So I enlisted the help of the one man in this room who knew Mom's estate just as well as I did. I gestured toward Harrison, the family attorney who stood quietly by the grand staircase. "Harrison and I worked together in absolute secrecy," I explained, watching Trey's eyes dart toward the attorney in pure, unadulterated betrayal. During one of Mom's supposed medical trips to Chicago, we sat down in my office conference room with a specialized estate planning team. We did not just update a simple piece of paper. We executed a comprehensive bulletproof legal maneuver. We helped Mom establish an irrevocable living trust. Aunt Patricia leaned forward, her brow furrowed in confusion. A few of the other relatives whispered among themselves, clearly unfamiliar with the specific legal terminology. Trey, however, understood enough about finance to recognize the sheer danger of those 3 words. His jaw tightened so hard I thought his teeth might shatter. "For those of you who are not familiar with high-level estate planning, let me break down the absolute beauty of this specific legal mechanism," I said, raising my voice to ensure the entire grand dining room absorbed the lesson. When a person creates a standard revocable will, they still legally own all their assets right up until the exact second they take their final breath. That leaves the estate entirely vulnerable. It leaves the door wide open for greedy relatives to exert undue influence, force deathbed signatures, and drag the entire family through years of exhausting probate litigation. I took a slow, deliberate step toward Trey, pointing a manicured finger directly at his chest. But an irrevocable living trust is an entirely different beast, I stated clearly. The moment Harrison finalized the paperwork and Mom signed on the dotted line, a massive permanent legal wall slammed down between her wealth and your predatory hands. We systematically gathered the $5 million investment portfolios, the offshore accounts you had not yet drained her antique collections, and every single liquid asset she possessed. We legally transferred complete ownership of every single penny directly into the trust. I watched the realization hit Trey like a physical blow. He staggered back slightly, his broad shoulders slumping under the crushing weight of his monumental defeat. The key word there is irrevocable. I continued hammering the reality into his fractured ego. That means the transfer is permanent, absolute, and completely unchangeable. Once those assets crossed the threshold into the trust, Mom surrendered her individual ownership entirely. The trust became a completely separate, legally autonomous entity that now held the family wealth. Mom became a beneficiary who could receive controlled living expenses, but she was no longer the legal owner. Caroline let out a sharp, ragged gasp, wiping her ruined mascara with trembling fingers. But the will, she stammered desperately, pointing a shaking hand at the document on the table. She signed this will 2 weeks ago. We saw her do it. She explicitly gave the estate to me. That brings me to the absolute masterpiece of this entire legal strategy, I replied, allowing a cold, victorious smile to finally grace my lips. Because the trust completely removes the assets from the individual's personal estate, those assets bypass the probate court entirely. They do not go before a judge. They are not subject to public disputes, and most importantly, Caroline, they cannot possibly be touched, claimed, or willed away by any subsequent documents. I picked up the notarized will from the mahogany table and held it up to the light. When you and Trey cornered a dying, exhausted woman in her bedroom 2 weeks ago and forced her to sign this piece of paper, you thought you were securing your lavish future, I said, my voice echoing with unrelenting authority. You thought you were pulling off the ultimate heist. But Mom signed this document knowing perfectly well that it was nothing but a worthless prop. She willed you her estate, knowing she did not legally own a single piece of it anymore. Harrison stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking against the hardwood floor. He nodded in firm agreement with my explanation. Rebecca is entirely correct, Harrison announced to the room, his authoritative tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. Sylvia Harrington possessed a personal net worth of roughly $400 in a basic checking account when she executed that document 2 weeks ago. The entirety of the family wealth has been safely locked inside the irrevocable living trust for exactly 24 months. And as the legally appointed trustee, I can confirm that the trust documents explicitly name Rebecca as the sole managing director and primary beneficiary of the remaining funds. Trey let out a visceral, guttural sound of pure rage. He grabbed the back of a heavy wooden dining chair, his knuckles turning white as he fought the urge to throw it across the room. He had spent years playing the charismatic, devoted son-in-law. He had lied, manipulated, and stolen his way through my mother's finances, firmly believing he was the smartest person in the room. He believed his aggressive tactics and slick charm made him completely untouchable. You set us up! Trey snarled, his eyes dark and wild with desperate fury. You planned this entire elaborate trap just to humiliate us. You let us pay those expensive lawyers to draft this will. You let us think we were secure. I did not set you up, Trey, I countered sharply, refusing to back down from his aggressive posture. You set your own trap the moment you decided to view my mother as a bank account instead of a human being. I simply locked the cage you willingly walked into. You tried to weaponize the legal system to steal her legacy, so I used that exact same legal system to build an indestructible fortress around it. The wealthy neighbors and extended relatives watched the exchange in stunned silence. The sheer magnitude of the deception and the brilliant, flawless execution of my countermeasure had left them completely speechless. Aunt Patricia stared at me with wide, fearful eyes, finally recognizing that the quiet, estranged niece she had spent years criticizing was actually a formidable, brilliant force who held the entire family's fate in her hands. "But we are not finished yet," I said, letting the notarized will flutter from my hand back onto the mahogany table. Because the $5 million investment portfolio was only one part of her estate. We still have to address the biggest, most expensive asset you are currently standing inside. Caroline looked around the grand foyer, her panicked eyes taking in the crystal chandeliers, the sweeping staircase, and the expensive antique furnishings. "The house," she whispered, her voice cracking with fresh terror. "What did you do to my house?" I took a slow, deliberate breath, preparing to deliver the final fatal strike to their completely shattered reality. "It is not your house, Caroline," I stated clearly, letting the words echo against the grand, sweeping staircase. "It has not been your house for a very long time." Trey took a step forward, his chest heaving as he tried to process this new nightmare. "What are you talking about?" he demanded. "We live here. We have always lived here. Living here does not equate to legal ownership." "Trey," I replied, maintaining my firm, icy composure. "When Mom and I reviewed the disastrous state of your financial affairs, I realized that simply moving this mansion into the irrevocable living trust would not offer enough protection. As a forensic accountant, I knew your massive business defaults and aggressive offshore lenders would eventually come knocking. I knew your creditors might attempt to place a lien on this physical property if you claimed residency or marital support through Mom. We needed an absolute impenetrable shield." I reached into my briefcase one last time and pulled out a single crisp folder. I opened it and slid the documents across the polished mahogany table. 2 years ago, Mom legally sold this entire estate. I explained, watching the blood drain completely from Caroline's face. She sold it to a private limited liability company registered in Delaware. "We did this to ensure total airtight anonymity and absolute asset protection from your impending bankruptcy." Trey stared at the deed of sale resting on the table. "Sold it to who?" he asked, his voice shaking with raw panic. I tapped my index finger directly onto the corporate registration document. "She sold it to a company where I am the sole managing director and the exclusive owner. I own this property, Trey. I hold the deed." Caroline let out a high, piercing shriek. She grabbed her hair, looking around the room as if the expensive artwork and crystal chandeliers were suddenly going to swallow her whole. "No," she wailed. "We pay the bills here. We maintain this place." "That brings me to my absolute favorite part of this entire forensic investigation," I said, allowing a cold, razor-sharp smile to finally cross my face. I looked directly into Trey's horrified eyes, delivering the ultimate fatal kill shot to his colossal ego. "Trey, do you remember that $3,000 HOA and maintenance fee you have been paying out of your own pocket every single month?" I asked. "The one you aggressively complained about but paid anyway to keep up the appearance of managing the estate." Trey swallowed hard. His knees actually buckled slightly. "This prestigious neighborhood does not have a homeowners association," Trey Weister announced loudly. "You were not paying maintenance fees. You were paying rent. To my LLC. You and Caroline have been my legal month-to-month tenants for the last 2 years." The absolute humiliation hit him like a freight train. The brilliant, charismatic luxury car dealer had just been exposed as nothing more than my oblivious rent-paying tenant. The collective shock in the dining room was palpable. Aunts and uncles covered their mouths, utterly stunned by the magnitude of my strategic checkmate. Trey's untouchable empire had been entirely dismantled brick by brick until absolutely nothing remained. The final shred of Trey's sanity snapped completely in half. The realization that he had spent the last 2 years funding my corporate accounts while thinking he was the master manipulator broke his brain. He let out a raw, deafening roar of pure, unfiltered rage that shook the crystal glasses on the remaining tables. His eyes dilated with violent fury as he lunged directly across the dining room, his large hands reaching violently for my throat. He never made it past the center of the room. My uncles, who had spent the entire evening watching this man humiliate our family, moved with surprising speed. 2 of my older uncles and a younger cousin intercepted Trey mid-lunge, tackling his broad shoulders and slamming him hard against the heavy oak credenza. Trey fought them like a cornered animal, kicking and thrashing wildly. The impeccable custom-tailored suit jacket he was so incredibly proud of ripped loudly at the shoulder seam. His expensive gold Rolex slammed against the wooden furniture, shattering the glass face entirely. "Get off me!" Trey screamed, his voice cracking hysterically as the men wrestled him down and pinned his arms firmly behind his back. "I will destroy you, Rebecca. I will burn this house to the ground before I let you take it." The charismatic, untouchable luxury car dealer was completely gone. In his place was a frantic, broke, and violently unhinged fraudster foaming at the mouth in front of the very high society crowd he had spent years trying to impress. The affluent neighbors stepped back in sheer horror, pulling out their phones to dial emergency services or simply record the spectacular downfall of the neighborhood's biggest con artist. Caroline stood frozen, watching her husband being physically subdued by our relatives. The sheer violence of his outburst finally cracked her deep state of denial. She looked around the grand foyer, seeing the disgusted faces of her country club friends and the absolute financial ruin staring right back at her. The $5 million estate was gone. The investment portfolios were locked away. The house belonged to me. Her knees buckled and she collapsed onto the hardwood floor. The fake, delicate weeping she had performed earlier vanished, replaced by harsh, ugly, hyperventilating sobs. These were the real tears of a woman who just realized she was completely destitute. Caroline scrambled across the floor on her hands and knees, grabbing the hem of my skirt with trembling, desperate fingers. "Rebecca, please," she wailed, her face contorted in absolute terror. "I am so sorry. I was wrong. I was desperate and terrified of him. You cannot do this to me. We are sisters. We share the same blood. I have nowhere else to go. You cannot put my family out on the street. Please have mercy on me." She looked up at me with mascara running down her flushed cheeks, begging for the exact same mercy she had entirely refused to show our dying mother. I stared down at the trembling woman clinging to my skirt. I felt absolutely no pity, no warmth, and no lingering sense of familial obligation. The iron boundary I had built over the last 3 years of intense specialized therapy was entirely impenetrable. I did not reach down to help her up. I simply took a deliberate step backward, forcing Caroline's manicured hands to slip off the high-quality fabric of my suit. She collapsed completely onto the floor, a pathetic, weeping heap of ruined designer clothing and shattered arrogance. "You want to play the family card now?" I asked, my voice cutting through her loud, ragged sobs like a freshly sharpened scalpel. "You want to invoke the sacred bond of sisterhood right at the exact moment you are facing federal prison time and complete financial ruin. That is incredibly convenient, Caroline. But we both know that your definition of family is entirely transactional. You only claim sisterhood when it provides you with a luxurious benefit or a convenient escape hatch from your own catastrophic consequences." Caroline looked up, her chest heaving as she struggled to catch her breath. She wiped her nose with the back of her hand, looking nothing like the flawless, wealthy socialite she had pretended to be just an hour ago. "Rebecca, please," she choked out, her voice raw and desperate. "I had no choice. Trey controlled the bank accounts. He controlled the dealership. He told me if I did not go along with it, we would lose the mansion and our entire social standing. I was terrified of him. I was a victim too." I let out a sharp, humorless laugh that echoed against the high vaulted ceiling of the foyer. The sheer audacity required to attempt that level of manipulation was genuinely staggering. "Do not dare cast yourself as a victim in this tragedy, Caroline," I fired back, raising my voice so every single relative and affluent neighbor standing in the room could hear the absolute truth. "You were not a terrified hostage trapped in a bad marriage. You were a highly active, incredibly enthusiastic co-conspirator. You happily swiped your black cards at high-end boutiques while Mom was taking her final agonizing breaths. You posed for tragic selfies next to her hospital bed to farm sympathy from strangers online, and then you immediately walked out to spend her stolen retirement funds on luxury spa treatments and weekend brunch dates." Caroline flinched, shrinking back against the hardwood floor, as if my words were physically striking her. The aunts and uncles who had previously adored her watched in horrified silence. They were finally seeing the deeply toxic, parasitic reality of the golden child they had enabled for 36 years. The illusion of the perfect, devoted eldest daughter was completely obliterated, exposing the greedy, manipulative thief underneath. "You did not care about family when you stole Mom's medical money," I stated coldly, delivering the ultimate reality check to my weeping sister. "You did not care about family when you stood in this very room next to her funeral flowers and tried to extort $75,000 out of me for a bill I already paid. You tried to throw me out of my own house just 10 minutes ago. So no, Caroline, you don't get to use sisterhood as a shield against the law today. That privilege has been permanently revoked." Caroline let out another loud wail, burying her face in her hands. She knew her victim routine had failed entirely. She was completely out of options, out of money, and out of allies. Her wealthy friends were actively backing away from her, terrified that her criminal toxicity might somehow infect their own pristine reputations. Harrison, the family attorney, watched the entire exchange with quiet approval, acknowledging the absolute legal and emotional authority I had firmly established in the room. I turned away from her sobbing form and walked calmly back to the mahogany dining table. My leather briefcase was still open, holding the final piece of legal documentation required to completely sever this deeply abusive relationship. I reached inside and pulled out a crisp, heavy folder containing a highly official, legally binding document bearing a fresh municipal court stamp. I walked back over to where Caroline was crumpled on the floor. I held the document out, letting it drop from my fingers. It landed flat on the polished hardwood right in front of her tear-stained face. The heavy paper hit the floor with a soft, definitive thud that signaled the absolute end of her reign. "What is that?" she whispered, staring at the thick white paper as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. "That is a formal, legally binding 30-day notice of eviction," I announced clearly and firmly. "As the sole managing director and exclusive owner of the corporate entity that holds the deed to this $5 million property, I am officially terminating your month-to-month tenancy." Caroline gasped, her eyes widening in renewed terror as her hands hovered over the official court seal. "You are kicking me out. My whole life is in this house. You cannot do this to me." "I am enforcing my legal property rights," I corrected her sharply. "Given the overwhelming forensic evidence of your severe financial fraud and active elder abuse, my attorney heavily advised me to file for an immediate emergency eviction. We easily could have had local law enforcement physically remove you and your belongings from these premises by midnight tonight. We could have watched the police drag you out onto the front lawn in front of all your wealthy friends. But unlike you, Caroline, I actually follow proper legal protocols. I am giving you the standard 30 days required by state law. You have exactly 1 month to pack your designer bags, gather whatever legally belongs to you, and vacate my property permanently." She looked up at me, her expression a mix of pure hatred and bottomless despair. "Where am I supposed to go?" she demanded, her voice cracking wildly. "My husband is bankrupt. Our accounts are frozen. I have absolutely nothing left to my name." "That sounds like a serious personal problem that you need to solve without my money or my mother's money," I replied, offering her zero warmth and zero sympathy. "You spent your entire life believing you were vastly superior to everyone else in this family. You believed your golden child status made you completely untouchable and immune to consequences. Now you get to find out exactly how well that arrogance pays the rent in the real world." I turned my back on her for the final time. I had established the iron boundary I had desperately needed my entire life. I had systematically dismantled their fraudulent empire, protected my mother's legacy, and reclaimed my own immense power. There was absolutely no room left for toxic emotional blackmail in my new reality. The era of the scapegoat was permanently dead. As I stood there absorbing the profound weight of my reclaimed freedom, a sudden sharp shift in the atmosphere pulled everyone's attention toward the front of the mansion. The heavy velvet curtains framing the grand foyer windows suddenly illuminated with intense, pulsing bursts of color. Flashing red and blue lights sliced through the darkness of the evening, painting the pale walls and the horrified faces of our guests in chaotic, alternating neon hues. The low, unmistakable rumble of heavy vehicle engines echoed up the long, manicured driveway, followed by the aggressive screech of tires, coming to a harsh stop directly outside the main entrance. Aunt Patricia gasped, bringing a trembling hand to her mouth. The wealthy neighbors who had been watching my sister's spectacular downfall now murmured in panicked confusion. They edged away from the center of the room, their self-preservation instincts overriding their morbid curiosity. Trey, who was still pinned against the heavy oak credenza by my uncles, snapped his head toward the windows. His dark eyes widened in absolute paralyzing terror. The aggressive fight completely drained from his massive frame, leaving him limp and shaking in the grip of his captors. He knew exactly what those flashing lights meant. He thought I had merely orchestrated a dramatic family confrontation to publicly shame him. He completely underestimated the clinical, ruthless efficiency of a forensic accountant. I do not just expose fraud at dinner parties. I build airtight, undeniable criminal cases. 3 days before this funeral reception, I did not just print out my spreadsheets for a dramatic reveal. I compiled a massive 400-page dossier containing every single piece of certified financial evidence. I included the forged signature analysis, the offshore banking routing numbers, the unauthorized wire transfer receipts, and the complete data scrape of Caroline's fraudulent crowdfunding campaign. I bound it all in a highly secured digital file and submitted it directly to the Financial Crimes Division of the federal authorities, as well as the local district attorney's office. I provided them with the perfectly structured, irrefutable roadmap of severe federal felonies. I handed them a silver platter containing undeniable proof of wire fraud, elder financial abuse, and interstate charity scams. The authorities did not need to spend months investigating Trey's complicated shell companies because I had already done the grueling investigative work for them. They only needed to review my findings, secure the necessary warrants, and arrive at the exact location I provided. Heavy authoritative pounding rattled the solid oak front door. The sound echoed like a final death knell through the silent house. Harrison, ever the composed legal professional, calmly walked across the foyer and opened the door. 4 uniformed police officers and 2 plainclothes federal agents stepped over the threshold. Their presence instantly obliterated any remaining trace of high society elegance in the room. The lead detective, a tall man with a stern, unyielding expression, scanned the terrified crowd before locking his eyes directly on the man pinned against the credenza. "We are looking for this owner of the luxury automotive group in question," the detective announced, his voice projecting absolute terrifying authority. "We have a federal warrant for his immediate arrest." My uncles immediately stepped back, releasing their grip on Trey. They raised their hands, signaling their complete cooperation with the authorities, and quickly moved away from the target. Trey staggered forward slightly, his torn custom suit hanging awkwardly off his broad shoulders. He held his hands up in a desperate, pleading gesture. "Officers, there is a massive misunderstanding here," Trey stammered, attempting to summon the smooth, charismatic salesman persona that had funded his entire fraudulent life. "We are just having a heated family dispute over an inheritance. My sister-in-law is simply upset and making wild accusations. If you just give me 5 minutes to contact my corporate legal team, I can clear this entire situation up." The detective did not even blink at the pathetic performance. He simply pulled a thick folded document from his jacket and held it up. "This is not a family dispute," the detective stated coldly. "This is a federal warrant. You are being formally charged with multiple counts of wire fraud, extensive elder financial abuse, and interstate financial deception regarding a fraudulent medical charity campaign. We already have the certified bank records, the offshore routing numbers, and the forged authorization forms. Your dealership accounts have been officially frozen by federal order as of 1 hour ago." Caroline let out a blood-curdling scream. The word frozen hit her harder than the arrest warrant itself. She scrambled up from the hardwood floor, her designer dress wrinkled and stained with tears. She threw herself toward the detectives, waving her hands frantically. "You cannot freeze our accounts!" Caroline shrieked, her voice echoing wildly across the foyer. "We have bills to pay. We have a lifestyle to maintain. He did not do anything wrong. My mother gave him that money." The second plainclothes agent stepped forward, blocking Caroline's path with a firm, immovable stance. Ma'am, I highly advise you to step back and remain completely silent, the agent warned sharply. Given your active participation in the crowdfunding campaign and your signature on several flagged transactions, you are currently an active subject in this ongoing federal investigation. Anything you say right now will be heavily documented and used against you. Caroline froze instantly. The very real threat of joining her husband in a prison cell snapped her mouth shut. She backed away, her entire body trembling violently as she realized her luxurious world was completely permanently eradicated. Two uniformed officers moved swiftly toward Trey. They grabbed his arm, spinning him around with practiced efficiency. The harsh metallic click of steel handcuffs echoing through the dining room sounded louder than any grand speech Trey had ever given. "You have the right to remain silent," the lead detective recited, his voice steady and completely devoid of mercy as he read the Miranda rights. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Trey did not fight. The towering, intimidating man who had spent the last 2 years bullying my dying mother and trying to physically attack me was reduced to a compliant, broken shell. His head hung low, his chin practically resting on his chest, as the officers marched him toward the open front door. The absolute spectacular public humiliation was finally complete. The affluent neighbors, the judgmental aunts and uncles, and the wealthy country club friends all stood in stunned, horrified silence. They watched the man they had admired, the man who had hosted them at lavish dinners funded by stolen money, being escorted out in handcuffs like a common criminal. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated his face one last time as he crossed the threshold. He cast a brief, terrified glance back over his shoulder, his eyes meeting mine for a fraction of a second. He saw exactly what I wanted him to see. He saw a forensic accountant who had meticulously, flawlessly destroyed his entire empire. The officers guided him out the door and down the long driveway toward the waiting squad cars. The heavy oak door swung shut behind them, sealing the incredible, undeniable victory I had just secured. The sharp click of the deadbolt sliding into place acted as an immediate release valve for the entire mansion. The suffocating, high-stakes tension that had gripped the dining room finally shattered. It was instantly replaced by the chaotic, desperate rustling of expensive fabrics and the hurried, anxious murmurs of the remaining guests. No one wanted to look at me. The affluent neighbors, the country club socialites, and the highly judgmental aunts and uncles who had spent the last 3 years publicly condemning my absence now scrambled over each other to escape. They wanted to aggressively distance themselves from the radioactive crater of Trey and Caroline's completely ruined lives. They grabbed their designer coats and expensive clutch purses from the antique console table with visibly trembling hands. Aunt Patricia walked past me, her eyes cast firmly down at the polished hardwood floor, utterly unable to meet my direct gaze. She muttered a rushed, hollow apology to the empty air before practically fleeing out the side entrance, terrified that her own financial association with Trey's fraudulent charity campaign might taint her pristine social standing. Within 10 short minutes, the grand dining room was entirely abandoned. The catered gourmet hors d'oeuvres sat untouched on silver platters. The crystal wine glasses caught the bright light of the chandelier, projecting scattered, fractured reflections across the empty room. I was finally left completely alone in the massive foyer. I let out a long, slow breath, feeling the intense residual adrenaline slowly drain from my system. My pulse, which had been beating with the calculated, relentless rhythm of a federal prosecutor for the past 2 hours, finally began to slow down. I untied the silk scarf at my neck and walked slowly away from the mahogany dining table. The thick, color-coded binders of forensic evidence remained stacked perfectly in a row, a silent monument to the financial war I had just decisively won. Harrison, the family attorney, had quietly excused himself after packing away the worthless notarized will, giving me a nod of profound professional respect before he departed. I moved silently through the quiet, expansive rooms of the first floor. I ran my hand along the edge of the crushed velvet sofa in the living room where my mother used to sit and read her mystery novels. The silence in the house was no longer heavy or oppressive. It felt remarkably clean. It felt like the air had been entirely purified after a long toxic sickness had finally been eradicated. I stopped in the doorway of the bright sunroom, looking at the empty space near the window where her medical equipment used to be positioned. A profound, incredibly complex sense of closure washed over me. I mourned my mother deeply. I mourned the decades of genuine connection we had lost to her blatant favoritism and her blinding obsession with superficial appearances. I grieved the sad fact that it took a terminal medical diagnosis and a massive financial betrayal for her to finally see my true value as a daughter. But layered deeply beneath that grief was a powerful, unbreakable sense of peace. I had not been able to save her life, but I had absolutely saved her legacy. I had protected her during her most vulnerable hours. I had given her the ultimate gift of safety, ensuring she took her final breaths, knowing her lifelong wealth would never again be used to fund the lavish, predatory lifestyle of the very people who callously exploited her. She had died completely free of their manipulation, and now so was I. The heavy burden of being the family's scapegoat had been permanently lifted off my shoulders. A sudden sharp scraping sound from outside drew my attention toward the front windows. I walked over and pulled back the heavy velvet curtain just enough to see out onto the circular paved driveway. The flashing red and blue lights were completely gone. The federal agents and local police cruisers had taken Trey away to a holding facility, leaving behind a cold, harsh reality. Caroline was stumbling out the front door, dragging two massive, overloaded designer suitcases behind her. Her manicured hands shook violently as she struggled to lift the heavy bags into the trunk of her white luxury SUV. She looked utterly frantic, throwing expensive cocktail dresses and branded handbags indiscriminately into the back seat. She was completely terrified, desperately trying to salvage the physical, superficial symbols of her fake wealth before the legal walls completely caved in around her. I watched her slam the trunk shut, with a frustrated, echoing cry that pierced the quiet suburban evening. She leaned against the bumper, sobbing into her hands, completely unaware of the absolute futility of her panicked actions. As a forensic accountant, I knew exactly what was going to happen next. I had thoroughly analyzed their debt structure. That pristine luxury SUV was currently leased under Trey's heavily leveraged dealership network. With his commercial accounts federally frozen and the entire automotive business entering Chapter 11 bankruptcy, by tomorrow morning that specific vehicle was heavily collateralized by aggressive creditors. Repossession agents would likely track down and seize that exact car before the end of the week. She was frantically packing her stolen luxury goods into a vehicle she no longer legally possessed, preparing to drive away into a completely bankrupt, legally treacherous future. The 30-day eviction notice I had dropped on the floor was the absolute least of her impending problems. I watched her start the engine, the headlights illuminating the dark driveway, as she sped away from the $5 million estate she thought she owned. I let the heavy velvet curtain fall back into place, blocking out the pathetic sight of my sister's frantic escape. The house plunged back into absolute tranquil silence. The dramatic storm had finally passed, and the incredible new chapter of my life was just beginning to unfold. 6 months later, the bright morning sun streamed through the massive bay windows of the grand foyer, casting warm light onto the polished hardwood floors. The house was no longer a suffocating monument to my mother's complicated legacy or a playground for my sister's fraudulent extravagance. I had completely transformed the $5 million estate. I chose not to sell the property. Instead, I stripped away the heavy, ostentatious antique furniture and replaced it with sleek, modern workstations, highly secure digital server racks, and rows of locked filing cabinets. The grand dining room, where I had systematically dismantled Trey's criminal empire, now served as the official headquarters for my rapidly expanding forensic accounting firm. We specialize exclusively in identifying, investigating, and aggressively prosecuting elder financial abuse. I walked down the sweeping staircase, holding a fresh cup of black coffee, listening to the energetic hum of my team, already hard at work. 5 senior investigators and 3 legal aides were busy tracking down hidden assets, auditing suspicious retirement account withdrawals, and preparing federal prosecution files for vulnerable senior citizens. Every single day, we use our specialized financial expertise to tear down the exact same kind of predatory criminals who tried to destroy my mother. The business is thriving beyond my wildest expectations. The massive wealth secured within the irrevocable living trust provides a permanent, unshakable foundation for my life. But the genuine fulfillment comes from the work we do right here in this house. We are returning stolen dignity to people who were manipulated by their own greedy relatives. The toxic family ties that once bound me have been permanently severed. I hold absolutely no contact with the people who stood in this room and condemned me. The legal system handled the rest with brutal efficiency. Trey is currently sitting in a federal detention center, awaiting trial on 14 counts of wire fraud and severe elder exploitation. The bankruptcy courts aggressively liquidated his entire automotive group, seizing every luxury car, every offshore account, and every remaining asset to pay back his defrauded creditors. Caroline lost her pristine country club membership, her designer wardrobe, and her entire false identity. She is currently working a minimum wage retail job in a completely different state, entirely cut off from the massive fortune she blindly assumed was her birthright. The golden child fantasy ended the moment the federal agents put her husband in the back of a squad car. I walked into my private office, taking a seat behind my large glass desk. A single, simple silver frame rests perfectly on the corner. It holds a photograph of Mom and me from one of our secret weekend trips to Chicago. We are sitting in an art museum, smiling, genuinely free from the heavy, suffocating expectations she used to force upon me. It serves as my daily reminder that people can change, but you must demand the absolute truth before healing can ever begin. For 33 years, I was designated as the family scapegoat. I was told my career was a joke, my independence was a major flaw, and my refusal to submit to their manipulation made me a terrible daughter. I spent my youth desperately trying to prove my immense worth to a family that was completely committed to misunderstanding me. I exhausted myself trying to earn a seat at a table where the game was entirely rigged against me. But here is the absolute truth about toxic families. You cannot heal in the exact same environment that broke you. You are not required to set yourself on fire simply to keep your abusive relatives warm. Blood does not give anyone a free pass to exploit your finances, manipulate your emotions, or constantly belittle your achievements. Real family is not automatically determined by a birth certificate. Real family is built on a solid foundation of mutual respect, unyielding honesty, and genuine care that does not completely evaporate the second you stop being financially or emotionally useful to them. If you are currently sitting in the shadow of a golden child watching your parents excuse horrific behavior while criticizing your every move, you need to understand your own immense power. You do not have to participate in their delusion. You do not have to sit at the dinner table and silently absorb their bitter insults just to keep a toxic peace. You have the absolute right to pack your bags, walk out the door, and build a spectacular life completely without them. It will be terrifying at first. They will call you selfish. They will tell the rest of the world that you are the villain of the story. They will attempt to rewrite history to make themselves the tragic victims of your newly established boundaries. Let them talk. Their false narratives cannot stop your actual success. The best response to family members who desperately want to see you fail is to become completely, incredibly, and untouchably successful on your own terms. Use your intelligence to build an unshakable foundation. Document everything. Protect your assets with ruthless legal precision. Establish ironclad boundaries and enforce them without a single ounce of guilt. When you finally stop pouring your vital energy into people who do not value you, you free up all that massive power to build an empire of your own. You get to choose your true family. You get to define your own immeasurable worth. And when the dust finally settles, you will find yourself standing in the bright light entirely free, realizing that the people who underestimated you were never actually in your league to begin with. You hold the pen to your own life story, and you never have to let a toxic relative write another chapter. If you've ever had to be the villain to protect your own peace, tell me your story in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of surviving toxic families. See you next time.